Bien, buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a la Universidad Iberoamericana. La charla que tenemos el día de hoy es los perpetradores del Holocausto, hombres ordinarios, que estará a cargo del profesor Christopher Browning. Agradecemos a todos y a todas su presencia y su... Are you ready, doctor, with your... You need translation? Or, okay, thank you. Agradecemos a todos y a todas su presencia el día de hoy. En particular agradecemos también la presencia del maestro David Fernández Dávalos, que es rector de nuestra universidad y que por cuestiones académicas, bueno, pues está muy interesado en este tipo de charlas, de pláticas y de discusiones. Muchísimas gracias, rector, por su presencia el día de hoy. Agradecemos en especial a la doctora Yael Siman, que se incorporará en algunos minutos más. Tenía algunos temas de agenda que le impidieron llegar a esta hora, pero la tendremos sin duda por acá. Y agradecemos también al doctor Manolo Vela Castañeda, que ha sido encargado de realizar varios eventos similares en el marco de los trabajos del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas de nuestra universidad. Él ha organizado eventos que tienen que ver con genocidios, con violencias en espacios de toda América, América Central, América Latina y México, y por supuesto para el departamento este tipo de eventos y de conferencias son fundamentales, porque de alguna manera apoyar este tipo de eventos y este tipo de conferencias nos permite de alguna manera visibilizar lo que para algunos autores desde la sociología contemporánea, como el profesor Boaventura Sousa Santos, nos permite visibilizar y traer a propósito de la sociología de las ausencias y de las emergencias, temas que probablemente no tienen la visibilidad que se requieran, y por medio de este tipo de espacios académicos, por supuesto, se los damos. Sin mayor preámbulo, doctor Vela, pasas de este lado, por favor. Les presento al doctor Browning e iniciamos inmediatamente la conferencia. El doctor Christopher Browning es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Carolina del Norte, donde fue profesor en el Departamento de Historia. Es miembro de la Academia de Ciencias y Artes en Estados Unidos. El profesor Browning ha realizado y ha estudiado ampliamente el tema de la Alemania nazi y el Holocausto. Ha escrito extensamente sobre tres temas, principalmente el primero sobre la toma de decisiones y políticas nazis con respecto a los orígenes de la solución final. El segundo de los temas que he trabajado es el comportamiento y los motivos de varios miembros de personal medio y de personal bajo involucrado en la implementación de la política judía nazi. Y el tercero de los temas que ha desarrollado es el uso del testimonio de sobrevivientes para explorar las respuestas y estrategias de supervivencia judía en ese contexto. Solamente vamos a leer algunos de los principales, de la principal obra que tiene el profesor Browning a propósito de esta temática. Uno de ellos del año 2010 es Remembering Survival, otro del 2004 es The Origins of the Final Solution, Nazi Policy del año 2000, entre muchos otros artículos y libros que ha escrito. Particularmente de importancia ha sido su obra, que en español fue titulada Aquellos hombres grises. Con ella, el profesor Browning ha logrado iluminar uno de los rincones más oscuros de la humanidad. Aquí, el profesor Browning explora las razones detrás de la decisión voluntaria de matar a otros seres humanos. En definitiva, se cuestiona o reflexiona sobre qué hace o qué implica que tropas decidan seguir esas órdenes de exterminio. Y por otro lado, qué implica tomar precisamente en sus manos vidas de gente inocente, por ejemplo, de civiles desarmados. Y es precisamente el día de hoy, la conferencia que hoy nos reúne para reflexionar sobre este y algunos otros problemas. Muchísimas gracias, profesor Browning. Welcome. And, por favor, ¿quiere acá? ¿Sí? Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much for the invitation to Mexico City. It's been a great adventure for my wife and I. On the topic of human rights, one of the most perplexing issues we face is this is going to be high enough. Okay. On the issue of human rights, one of the most perplexing questions that we face is to explain the extreme behavior of the perpetrators, the people who violate the human rights of others. In particular, how do we explain why some human beings engage in the mass murder of other human beings? My own research into this area relates to the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. And in looking at Nazi perpetrators, one of the key difficulties a researcher faces, an historian faces, is that perpetrators are not all alike, that they in fact participate in mass murder in very different ways with different motivations, so that a simple kind of explanation becomes impossible. Certainly, if one looks at Nazi Germany, we can see one category of perpetrator are what I would call the ideologues, those who are articulating the ideology of the regime and explaining the rationale that leads to mass murder. These are usually at the top. Certainly Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and Nazi Germany are the key ideologues. But they cannot carry out mass murder on their own. They need to harness many experts in society. Any modern society to do anything requires its experts, and that includes genocide. So for Nazi Germany, they needed the officer corps of the army to conquer Europe, where the bulk of the Jews lived. They needed the industrialists to arm their armed forces to create a military economy. They needed top bureaucrats to draw up the laws that would be the basis for a pseudo-legal persecution. So that experts became another component. They needed lots of what I would call middle echelon managers, people who at the middle level of the administration often never see a victim, never beat a victim, never shoot a victim, but organize. These are the managers of genocide that basically organize the work of others. And finally, of course, they are the face-to-face killers, the people who actually carry out the killing. They see their victims, and they are the ones that, even though many others are behind it, are going to carry out the actual taking of human life. Now, it is this last category that is often the most difficult to research, because unlike the ideologues, who write and speak a great deal, and unlike the experts and the middle managers, who also often leave a paper trail of memoranda and files, the face-to-face killers basically do not write documents. They seldom leave collections of letters or diaries. And afterwards, if they are caught, they generally try to deny everything and are not interested in telling the truth for the historical record. So getting at the issue of the face-to-face killers is one of the greatest challenges an historian of genocide faces. And I was very fortunate to come across a collection of documents that enabled me to attempt, at least, to write the history of one killing unit of some 500 men who did engage in face-to-face killing, over 200 of whom were interrogated after the war at length, and thus, in a rare case, left us with a great density of testimony. Not all of them, of course, telling the truth, but nonetheless, with over 200 people being interrogated, it allows the historian to cross-check and to engage in a level of research that is very rare in genocide. We seldom get a collection of documents of that sort. The unit in question was called Reserve Police Battalion 101. It was a unit from the city of Hamburg, and what immediately drew my attention to it were two factors. One, the density of testimony that we had, a rare case where the roster of the killing unit survived the war, was not destroyed, so that post-war investigators could find the names and track down people. It was a unit that was locally based. That is, the people who were in it came basically from the city of Hamburg and the area around, so that a single investigative team simply looking up former members of the killing unit in the Hamburg area could, in fact, locate and interrogate 210 people. An extraordinary percentage in terms of this kind of task. The second aspect that made this such an important case, not only the density of testimony, the amount of evidence, the second important key was that before the first massacre that this unit carried out, the commanding officer, a man named Major Trapp, gave a speech to his men. And in that speech, he first tried to justify what they were going to do. They were going to go into a village in Poland, a village of Józefów. They were going to round up some 17 or 1,800 Jews. They were going to select the young, work-capable Jews, about 300, to send off to a work camp. And then they were going to shoot the remaining 1,500 Jews in cold blood in a forest outside the village of Józefów. These men had never done anything like this before. This was their initiation to mass murder. So the commander tried to make sense of it, gave a series of rationales, and then in the end remarkably said that any of the men who did not feel up to it did not have to participate. They could turn in their rifles, that this was a rare case where we have an open offer by the commander of the unit that the men of that unit do not have to engage in killing if they don't want to. Now this was very key because almost every perpetrator after the war from Nazi Germany, when questioned, almost invariably invoked that they acted under duress, that they were coerced, that they were forced. If they had not killed others, they or their family would have been killed instead. And it turns out this is an alibi, this is a myth. Nothing like that happened. But nonetheless, particularly in this case, we have the open offer of the commander that makes very clear that the men had choice. And so the combination of choice on the one hand and the density of testimony on the other made this then an ideal case study to look at a killing unit and to try to see what the dynamics of the killing unit were. How do we explain why they engaged in mass murder as they did? As I worked through some 30 volumes of testimony given by, as I say, some 210 policemen, and then tried to work that into a narrative that would combine all of these testimonies, a number of conclusions finally emerged. The first of these was that the men of this unit were very unlikely, at least given our normal assumptions, were the least likely people in Nazi Germany to have become mass murderers. On the one hand, by age, they were middle-aged. Average age of this unit was 39 and a half to 40 years old. This was 1942 when they were conscripted, drafted, but because they were beyond the age that the German army was interested in, they wanted younger soldiers, They had to do their compulsory wartime service in a reserve police battalion, the assumption being that they would be far behind the lines, would not be engaged with the enemy, that men of older age could carry out occupation duties that would not involve great physical strain, and that even 40-year-olds would be able to perform useful functions to the German occupation. Most of these men came from the German working class. Now, in Germany, the people from all classes voted for the Nazis, but in the working class, they voted for the Nazis in less percentages and lower proportions than other groups. More of them voted for the socialists or the communists. They were the social group least seduced by Nazism, least attracted to Nazism, and who held out in higher percentages in terms of voting for parties that were in opposition to the Nazis. And finally, the city of Hamburg was a city the Nazis had difficulty with. In many cities, they made very substantial progress in Nazifying the city, taking it over politically. Hamburg was a more difficult city. They often referred to it as Red Hamburg because the socialist and communist and labor unions were stronger there. So that if one were going to try to choose a group of people in Germany designed to be the least likely people to become mass killers on behalf of the Nazis, one would have chosen people of middle age. They were too young to have fought in World War I, too old to have gone to school under the Nazis. The Nazis were not in power yet. Their formative period would have been in the democracy of the Weimar Republic. And they would have come from the working class, where a higher percentage would not have had sympathy with the Nazis. And this was that group, middle-aged, working-class Hamburg men that are drafted into Reserve Police Battalion 101 in the middle of the war in 1942. In fact, they will become one of the most deadly killing units in the Third Reich. As we shall see, that ultimately these 500 men in total either executed or put on the trains to the death camp of Treblinka, some 83,000 people. So it was indeed a very lethal unit. A second important aspect, of course, as I have just mentioned, was that here choice was clear. The men, in giving their testimonies, could not say, well, I was forced to, I had no choice, because the offer of the major had been testified to by too many people. So they had to explain their behavior in other ways. And it meant that we got testimony that was much more realistic, much more, or less blatantly mendacious, less obviously untruthful than in other post-war testimony, that the issue of choice was there, and some of the men at least had to wrestle with that. Another conclusion I drew was that in this first massacre, the village at Josefov, where they killed some 1,500 Jews, was very traumatic for them. The men were very upset. They didn't know this was going to happen. They were not given warning until the morning of the massacre. They were not prepared for it. And that their testimonies were that they had been, in a sense, distraught, dismayed, upset. And as one of the men testified, he said, if I had to do that again, I think I would have gone crazy. In fact, they would do it again and again and again and again. But at least in the first massacre, this was still a very traumatic, highly emotional, and highly disturbing experience. Another thing we find, very discouragingly, is that over time, how quickly they became used to what they were doing, how quickly they became habituated to what they were doing. That mass killing became routine, it became normal, it no longer was a cause for distress, it no longer upset people, it was simply part of what they did as a job, and all of the emotions that the first day of massacre caused very quickly subsided, as they became routine killers. Over the course of time, the men also divided into roughly 3 groups. One group were men that I call the eager killers, those that in fact learned to enjoy killing other human beings. They volunteered for the opportunity. They went out on the so-called Jew hunts where they hunted for Jews who were hiding. They volunteered for the firing squads. They would come back from their killing actions laughing and telling jokes to each other and sitting down to a hearty meal because they in fact were enjoying what they were doing. A middle group are what I would call the accommodators or the compliers. These are people that did as they were asked, even though they didn't have to, they had choice, but they chose to simply follow the policies of the battalion rather than stick out as someone who was refusing. But they didn't volunteer. It was not something they enjoyed doing, but it was clear, given a preference, that they would choose to participate in killing rather than confront their officers and say that they did not want to take part. And so they would conform to the killing policies of the unit rather than be one of those that chose not to participate. And then there was a third group that I call the evaders, those that did take up the offer of the major, did choose, in fact, not to take part in the killing, and were perfectly allowed to. They suffered no significant disadvantages or punishment for this because this was the major's policy. Some of his officers didn't like this. They would have preferred to be able to force their men to participate. But in fact, no officer could force his men to shoot because the policy of the commanding officer was otherwise. But those who did not shoot, nonetheless, for the most part, took part in other aspects of the killing process. That is, before any killing process, one had to go into the ghetto, round up Jews, bring them to the town center, separate out work Jews who would be left alive, march off the Jews that were going to be killed, form the cordon around the execution site, or march people to the train where they would be locked in boxcars and sent to the nearby death camp of Treblinka. So there were lots of activities essential to the killing process that did not involve actually shooting somebody at point-blank range. And one of the other conclusions I came to was that even the most crude division of labor, even the most simple division of labor between someone who actually pulled the trigger, someone who in fact shot somebody at point-blank range, and others who simply rounded up Jews and guarded the execution site was immense. The latter group felt much detached, as if they had no responsibility for what was happening. They spoke as if they were very distanced from this, and in fact they're standing 10 feet from places where people are having their heads blown off all day. That they're marching hundreds of people to boxcars to be locked up and sent off to the gas chambers of Treblinka. And yet, because they are not doing the actual killing, they feel a sense of detachment, a lack of responsibility. They're just rounding up, they're just guarding, someone else is killing, so they are not responsible. And finally, another conclusion I came to was for those who did decide not to shoot, those who were the evaders, those who said that they would not participate in the killing, the standard way of doing this was to say that they were too weak. They didn't challenge the policy. They didn't say mass killing of people is wrong. They didn't say what their comrades in the unit were doing was wrong. Rather, they said, I am too weak. I don't have a tough enough stomach, a tough enough constitution to do this, so I am opting out because I'm inferior. Now, what this did then insidiously was to basically affirm, validate what the killers were doing. And when the people who opted out took upon themselves the onus of being the weaklings, of being the cowards, in order to not challenge the regime, to not criticize their comrades, and this was the easiest way to excuse oneself. So the evaders did in fact, not take part in the killing, but the way in which they did it nonetheless basically left the actions of the unit unchallenged. In fact, it confirmed the actions of the others, so they presented no moral challenge to the people who were killing. And quite the contrary, they were portraying those who took part in the killing as being the tough people and that they were the weak people. And so there was a kind of insidious inversion. Those, in fact, who had the courage not to go along, who had the courage not to shoot, had to portray themselves, on the contrary, as lacking courage, as being too weak to take part in the shooting. When I had finished sort of writing the narrative and coming to those conclusions, I still was facing the bigger question. Basically, why do people who as individuals would never have done this on their own, nonetheless acting within a group, become mass killers? Why do people who didn't have to shoot choose nonetheless to conform and to go along with what the battalion was doing? Why did the bulk of the battalion, rather than a small minority, become mass killers on behalf of the Nazi regime? Now, one approach to this that I did not find satisfactory was that of psychology, that would look at this as an issue of individual abnormality. Certainly the assumption after the war immediately was what these men had done was so strange, so perverse, that they must have been psychologically abnormal. But as historians did the research and found out how wide participation was, how the path to that was so banal, so ordinary, the notion that somehow you had gotten a collection of abnormal people simply was not sustainable. And so the approach of psychological abnormality was not going to be an answer to why the vast bulk of the battalion, among many other killing units in Germany, behaved as they did. At that point, sociology offered two models. One was that of Weberian bureaucracy, the value-free bureaucracy that will look only at how well they are doing the job assigned, not the purpose and the morality of that job itself. Useful for trying to understand the middle managers, useful for understanding the bureaucratic aspects of killing, but not very applicable to a killing unit itself. And another sociological approach was that of the pathology of modernity. Zygmunt Bauman's book on the Holocaust and modernity at that point was very popular. But there's nothing modern about the grassroots killers of 101. This was not the assembly line industrial killing of the death camp. These were people who went out in the old-fashioned way, rounded up their victims, and killed them face to face. It was old-fashioned genocide, not modern industrial genocide. That was some perversion of modernity. So the approach that I found most useful was the approach of social psychology, of interaction of people acting in groups. This is a group endeavor. These are not a collection of individuals, but these are people acting within a group context. And so it was to look at what social psychologists tell us about the dynamics of group behavior that, for me, were going to become sort of the key approach. And here we had at least three social psychologists that had done, I think, important research that was useful to me. One was the research of Solomon Asch in The Power of Conformity. how people in groups are very susceptible to following the norm of the group rather than to follow their own conscience if those two are in conflict. And that conformity is a very powerful shaper of human behavior within groups, particularly tight-knit groups like a military unit, but even in randomly collected groups. In fact, social psychological experiments show that people are heavily influenced by what everyone else around them is doing. And there is a great reluctance to stick out and to follow a different path from what everyone else around you is doing. A second insight from social psychology was a deference to authority. That in fact, when people when we raise our children, when we train people for jobs, basically we are always socialized to accept authority. Life runs more smoothly if people accept a certain amount of authority. It's not going to be total anarchy. And so we find also, particularly within a group framework, authority figures have the ability to sway human behavior significantly. Some of you may know of the Stanley Milgram experiments on the deference to authority, in which people would in fact engage in think they were engaged in inflicting terrible pain in this experiment, but most people went along as long as a scientist was telling them it was important for progress, important for science, that is simply an actor dressed up like a scientist in a white lab coat and a clipboard, telling people that what they were doing was crucial for science, could induce people to carry out what they thought was in effect the torture of another human being. Another aspect of group behavior is role adaptation. People adapting to the roles that they have been assigned to. And particularly this is important in the military or in a paramilitary unit like a reserve police battalion. A civilian will understand that they have certain prerogatives, freedom of choice, but if you put them in a uniform and explain that once they're in a uniform and part of a military unit, they are subject to military discipline, they are expected to follow out and do what good soldiers do, which is to obey orders, and to carry out the assignments of their unit. In fact, people will do things as part of a unit, as a soldier or as someone in uniform, that they would never choose to do on their own. And here we have the Philip Zimbardo so-called prison experiment, in which he had certain people role-play prisoners and others role-play prison guards, all chosen at random, and very quickly some of those chosen as prison guards became extraordinarily domineering and cruel, in a sense living the power that this new role had given them, getting high, one might say, on the authority that this new role had given them. So I looked to social psychology in terms of trying to make sense of what my unit had done, and I did find, in fact, that conformity and deference to authority and role adaptation were very key in explaining why a group of randomly drafted middle-aged Germans could mold itself into a highly efficient killing unit, as Battalion 101 did in the Second World War. Now, when I published the book, there were a number of criticisms made of the conclusions I had drawn, and I would like to go through some of those, and some of them have more merit than others, some of them less. One of the first criticisms was to, in fact, criticize my reliance on social psychology. The argument was that social psychology removes human responsibility. that people are simply doing what, that they don't have choice, they're doing what the social psychologist has predicted they would do, and behaving predictably somehow was equated with denying that these people had exercised choice. I think this was a mistaken notion. We know social psychologists themselves have done experiments on how people perceive their arguments, and it is indeed a perception, but in this case a false perception, that a social psychological explanation is one that does not involve or absolves individuals of human responsibility. But I would argue quite the contrary. These experiments all show that some people do not go along. Just as there were evaders in 101, so in all of these experiments there were people who chose to do other than what the majority did. So what the experiment does, it didn't mean these people didn't have choice, it simply allows us to predict what the majority of people will do, but it doesn't prohibit or it doesn't compel anyone to behave in that way. So I think the whole notion that somehow a social psychological explanation is an exculpation of the perpetrator is wrong. In fact, these experiments, because in each of them there were always those who did not go along, once again shows, just as in the case of 101 with the evaders who did not go along, that people are making choices, people are exercising human responsibility, that we are not removing their moral responsibility with that kind of explanation. A second criticism was that Police Battalion 101 was not typical, was not representative of most German killing units. That I'd call my book Ordinary Men, but that most of the killers were not ordinary men, but ideological warriors, self-conscious ideological warriors set out to fulfill an ideological goal. Now, I would say this argument was half right and half wrong. It was right in the sense that Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not a typical unit. First of all, we have not only the police battalions doing killing, we also have military units, and of course most noted were the so-called Einsatzgruppen, young SS units that were doing the killing. So it was simply one of a number of different kinds of killing units. And even among the order police battalions, there were three different categories. And the other two were made up of younger men who had been selected often before the war, at the beginning of the war. Their average age was much lower. They had been subjected to much more training, much more indoctrination. Their percentage of Nazi Party members, their Nazification, was much higher. And they had been sent out and had considerable time in occupied territory learning to enforce racial imperialism, learning to be the master race on behalf of Nazi Germany long before they actually engaged in mass killing. Reserve Police Battalion 101, being a very late unit, drafted and put together in 1942, coming up, made up of middle-aged men, very little training, very little indoctrination, a percentage of Nazi Party members roughly the same as the rest of the German population, so it was simply a random selection. No prior experience in occupation. They were sent to Poland, and 3 weeks later, without notice, they engaged in their first massacre. Is different. It is most units were not like this, but 101 indeed, in terms of its age, in terms of its lack of training and indoctrination, in terms of its lack of careful selection, a random draft by now when Germans are taking the dregs of the manpower pool. The lone, not particularly not different in terms of its Nazi Party membership, all made Reserve Police Battalion different from many other killing units. But the scary thing is, that did not make any difference in how it behaved. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was the fourth most deadly police battalion by body count in the entire Third Reich. There's over 100 of these battalions. Most of them are made up of younger men. Most of them made up of people who are indoctrinated and Nazified and brutalized by prior experience. But nonetheless, 101, in fact, as I say, would kill many more people than all but 3 other battalions, and that things that we used to think were at least essential or conducive, the fact that people wouldn't kill if there was not indoctrination, if there was not lots of training, if there was not special party ideological identification, Nazification in this case. If there wasn't prior brutalization, how would you get men to kill? The reality is, without any of those, Police Battalion 101 nonetheless became one of the most efficient police battalion killing units. Another criticism that was made was that I had ignored ideology, that I had offered what is referred to as a situational explanation, and that the main critic in that regard was a man named Daniel Goldhagen, who wrote a book 4 years after Ordinary Men entitled Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he argued that the reason these men killed was not because they were responding to the dynamics of a killing unit in terms of conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation, but because they had been raised in a German culture that imbued them with what he called a eliminationist anti-Semitism, and that overwhelmingly they all believed in the necessity and the justice of killing Jews down to the last man, woman, and child. That all Germany were little Hitlers who firmly believed in the ideological cause of a genocide of European Jews. And the argument was he had offered the ideological explanation, I had offered the situational explanation. One of the most useful comments on the debate that occurred between us was by a social psychologist named Leonard Newman, who argued this is a false dichotomy. In fact, there is no situation that is neutral. Everybody who finds themselves in a situation interprets that situation, constructs that situation, depending upon the cultural assumptions that they have. And so Germans who came to Poland, like 101, would have with them assumptions about what it meant to defend your country in wartime, what the obligations were of someone wearing a uniform, and these kinds of things, and that other people in other wars would have these same kinds of assumptions. Let me try to give a kind of counterexample to try to show what I mean. The Milgram experiment all depended upon the people in the experiment honoring science, accepting science as important, and if someone said, you must continue doing what you're doing because it's important for progress in science, this would have leverage on them because they would construct what they were doing as contributing to scientific progress. Now, if you took somebody, a tribesman from New Guinea who had absolutely no concept of what science was, and put him in that position, the experiment would be meaningless because he wouldn't even understand what the argument was for what they were doing, because he would have a totally different cultural assumption about what was taking place. So you can't, in fact, separate ideology from a situation. The situations are constructed in part through cultural assumptions and through an ideological framework. And any explanation we're going to have is going to have to combine both cultural assumptions on the one hand and situational factors on the other. And finally, the last major criticism, again one that was made by Daniel Goldhagen, was that I had simply misunderstood the testimony, that I had been duped by the lies of the policemen who had been interrogated. Now, using post-war testimony of perpetrators is, of course, very problematic, they have very little motive to tell all the truth. They have a great motivation to tell a partial truth or to lie to cover up what they have done. And the historian has to use that material, of course, very carefully. Goldhagen and I agreed that some of this testimony was easily seen as lies, particularly among the officers. They just told fantastic stories that nobody believed, neither he nor I. We wrote it off immediately. And some of the men gave such incriminating testimony that there was no reason to suspect. No one would tell what they had said about themselves and what they had done and make it up because it was so incriminating. So we had a band of testimony both of us agreed we could dismiss as untruthful. We had a band of testimony we could both accept because we agreed it was so incriminating it had to be believable. But there was a broad middle band of testimony in which people told some of the truth some of the time. Often, in fact, they would tell the truth about what the unit had done, even if they did not tell the truth about what they personally had done. And Goldhagen's position was to use no testimony that in any way could be seen as potentially self-exculpatory, could be seen as possibly an alibi or a lie on behalf of the individual policeman. My view was that we had to use this testimony, use it carefully, but that there was much too much in that testimony that one could not simply pass it up. The result is his account basically relied only on the testimony of what I would say were the eager killers, the true believers. And then he mistook the part for the whole and said everyone else was like that too. But if we look at this middle band, we begin to get a much more complex situation, much more complex portrayal of different people reacting and participating in different ways. In fact, I would argue, if your hypothesis is that all of these men participated eagerly because they had a culturally imbued lethal anti-Semitism, and you can only use the testimony in which people basically admit that they're true believers, then of course you cannot, you have testimony, the evidence you use can do no other than confirm the hypothesis the evidence is supposed to test. You come up with a guaranteed confirmation of your hypothesis. If you use the partial truths, if you use the testimony by men who are telling some of the truth some of the time, you in fact get a much more complex picture, a much more, I would say, realistic picture than one does with the Goldhagen portrayal. He in particular was very critical of the notion that the battalion had divided into three groups, and that there were eager killers, there were conformers, and there were evaders. And his view was that 95% of these people were all eagerly involved in the killing. Now this is a proposition in a sense that we can test with outside evidence. If the issue is, am I or is he reading the policeman's testimony more correctly, we have to find some other kind of evidence in which to look at the same phenomenon that does not involve the policemen themselves. And we do have a very rare case. We do have the testimony of a man named Oswald Rufeisen. Oswald Rufeisen was a Jew born in Silesia. Silesia is a territory on the border between Germany and Poland. And people raised there usually were bilingual, fluent in German and in Polish. And the Jews in that area spoke Polish and German, not like further east where their mother tongue was Yiddish. And if they tried to speak German, it was immediately apparent that they were speaking Polish and German with a very distinct Jewish Yiddish accent. So Oswald Rufeisen could pass as a German. He fled Silesia in 1939 when the Germans invaded and went to Lithuania. The Germans invaded Lithuania in 1941. He fled south from Lithuania to what is now Belarus. And in the village of Mir, he was intercepted by the Belarusian police captain of the village of Mir, who asked him what he was doing and asked him for his papers. And Rufeisen said his papers had been stolen. He was a 17-year-old kid. And he gave his background as being someone with a German father and a Polish mother. He was of mixed ancestry. And because he could speak both languages fluently without an accent, this was a plausible explanation. So the police captain said, okay, I'm going to need a German translator when the Germans come and set up a police station in Mir, which they were about to. You will come home and live with me and be my translator. So the young Jewish boy is going to live in the house of the police captain, of the Belarusian police captain. When the Germans arrive and set up a police station, they are middle-aged German reservists of the order police, exactly like the composition of 101. And Sergeant Hein, in command of the German police, immediately wants young Oswald Rufeisen to be his translator. So Oswald Rufeisen, a hiding Jew, is living in the house of the Belarusian police captain, and by day is sitting at the right hand of Sergeant Hein, the German police commander, conducting all of his business with the local population that required a translator. So Oswald Rufeisen, for 8 months, is inside a German police station with a complete view of the dynamics of that unit, and doesn't have, of course, any of the motivation to lie about that. And so we can see, in a sense, how he diagnoses what the group dynamic of that group of German policemen was. And he tells us, in fact, that they divided into 3 groups. There were 4 men in this group of 13 who were the eager killers that went out and killed whenever they could and were very happy to do it. There were a group of people who refused to go on actions involving the killing of Jews. And as he said, it was as if they had the right to not do that. And then there was what he called the passive executioners of orders, would do what they were told, but certainly didn't volunteer for various actions. And I can just quote from Rufeisen himself in talking about this middle group. It was clear that there were differences in their outlooks. I think that the whole business of Jewish extermination they considered unclean. The operations against the partisans were not in the same category. For them, a confrontation with partisans was a battle, a military move. But a move against Jews was something they might have experienced as dirty. So he confirms the very division that I did, and I think that that speaks for the fact that that my more complex portrayal of the battalion came closer to the truth, closer to the correct interpretation of the policemen's testimonies than that of Goldhagen. There's one other way we can look at this issue, and that is to look at a comparison. Now, of course, one of the difficulties is that in other mass killings, other genocides, we have very little record compared to that of Nazi Germany. Because we know much more about the perpetrators of Nazi Germany than about other genocides. But there is one exception where we have a better record, and that is Rwanda. And I was very fortunate to have been at the Holocaust Museum as a visiting scholar when a man from Rwanda, a psychiatrist named Athanase Hagen Gamana, was also there. And he, in fact, came from an unusual background. He was half Hutu and half Tutsi, so a mixed marriage, product of a mixed marriage. One of his sisters was in jail as a genocidaire, as someone who had been involved in the mass killing. One of his sisters had been killed as a Tutsi, so he was someone who was straight down the middle in almost every regard. He survived, and his first instinct was to use his abilities as a psychiatrist to come to the aid of the traumatized survivors. So he worked in the displaced persons camp in Tanzania on the border of Rwanda with the traumatized survivors. But then he thought this was a unique opportunity to also work with the perpetrators, because in the jails on the border were also arrested genocidaires. And he asked permission to go into the prisons and to talk with the accused and to bring his psychiatric tools to bear to try to figure out why they had done what they had done. So he offered one instrument of research he did was to circulate among the prisoners a questionnaire of self-reporting. How deeply involved were you in the killing process? And surprisingly, a fair number confessed to having been deeply involved. And it was just with that group, of the people who were self-confessed to have been deeply involved in killing, that he then gave a second instrument in which he tried to figure out every question he could think of related to motivation, every possible conceivable motive. And he said when the results came back, it was unlike any other research tool that he had sent out. That almost all the questions had no correlation, but two clusters of questions had very high correlation, had two flat lines and then two peaks. One cluster of questions centered around how one viewed the victim. That is the ideological framing, and that they generally had dehumanized their victims. Their victims were cockroaches, were vermin, they were not human beings. They did not identify or conceive or explain what they had done in terms of murdering other human beings. They had so dehumanized their victim. The ideological framing to dehumanize was one essential component. The second cluster of questions, really was sort of the situational one, in which the questions basically had to do with the need for these men to be held in high esteem by their comrades, to have been considered tough by their comrades, to have been considered doing more than asked, to have been doing more than their share, to have been leaders and models of efficient killers, and aspiring, in a sense, to be recognized by their peers as having been genocidaire of the most extreme kind. So in that research, basically, he came up with both a ideological factor and a situational factor, and both, in fact, appeared in the same people. They were not mutually exclusive, that they were necessary and self-reinforcing. So I took that indeed as an outside confirmation. If the evidence of Oswald Rufeisen was from within the Holocaust, this was a confirmation from outside the Holocaust into the dynamics of killing units, and that I think that in that sense the conclusions I came to have been managed to stand the test of time, and I'm very grateful the book still is at the center of conversations about perpetrators and the violation of human rights. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor, for your lecture, an extraordinary lecture. Y ahora empieza pues una segunda parte de la conferencia con las preguntas, sus comentarios a la exposición que el profesor ha realizado. Quisiera decirles además que esta es la primera de una serie de 4 conferencias que el profesor Browning estará ofreciendo en la Ciudad de México. Esto continúa esta misma tarde a las 4 de la tarde en la Universidad Anáhuac, en el campus norte, para los que quieran continuar. Y el día de mañana hay pues un evento un poco más grande con otros conferencistas, en el cual el profesor Browning va a tomar parte en Memoria y Tolerancia, el Museo Memoria y Tolerancia. A las 4 de la tarde será esta conferencia, y continúa el día miércoles con otra conferencia en el Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas de la UNAM. Entonces, ese es el ciclo de conferencias. En esto hemos participado la Universidad Iberoamericana, la Universidad Anáhuac también, y Memoria y Tolerancia. y hace parte también de una iniciativa de UNESCO y del Museo sobre el Holocausto de Washington, the US Memorial Holocaust Museum en Washington. Y pues eso. Ahora quisiéramos pasar entonces a las preguntas que ustedes tengan. Ustedes pueden presentar su pregunta en español. Allá la profesora Marisol está haciéndonos el favor de traducir y ella le podrá traducir al profesor. Ah, ok, ya. Entonces pueden hacer su pregunta en español y mucho gusto le traduciremos al profesor para que haya una comunicación ahí fluida. Quienes no han tomado aparato pueden tomarlo ahora, están allá afuera. Listo, entonces, ¿quién quiere empezar con una pregunta, un comentario, algo ahí? Damos la bienvenida a la profesora Yael, que se ha incorporado, es otra de las organizadoras de esta serie de conferencias. Adelante entonces.
¿La puedes leer en español o...?
Sí, sí, por favor.
¿En español la digo?
Bueno.
¿Cómo se puede explicar que los eager killers de los que hablaba acepten la responsabilidad completa de sus actos? O sea, yo entiendo que una cosa es, bueno, no lo entiendo, pero que una cosa es disfrutar matar a la gente y la otra es hacer público y abiertamente explícita la responsabilidad de que tú los mataste. ¿Cómo se entiende eso dentro de la investigación que hace?
In a sense, one of the difficult questions is understanding what the killers thought of themselves as they were doing this. How did they understand what they were doing? And I think for them, when one reads the post-war testimony, what comes out is not a sense of guilt, is not a sense of remorse, but a very strong sense of self-pity. That the response is, I was drafted into this unit, I did what my government told me to do then, it was dirty work, but I did it anyway. And now, 20 years later, after having had the terrible bad luck to be assigned to a killing unit, now 20 years later in Germany, they've changed the rules, and what I did then, loyal to my government, has now been turned into a crime. Now I'm being tried, so I'm doubly unlucky. I'm unlucky to have been sent to a killing unit, and I'm unlucky now to be in trial for doing something that wasn't considered a crime then, but is considered a crime now. Poor me. There's no expression of remorse or sense of identity with the victim. There's not poor victim. There's no word at all about the families that they've killed, but a great sense of self-pity about how unlucky they are.
Muy bien, vamos acá entonces.
Creo que sí, mejor en español. Buenas tardes, venimos de un colegio judío, de hecho, venimos aquí con chicos de preparatoria y tanto yo como mi colega somos maestras y de hecho enseñamos el batallón 101 a nuestros chicos cuando estamos enseñando lo que es el holocausto y the human behavior, el comportamiento humano. ¿Cuál sería? Me queda claro que la formación humana es lo que nos quedaría como esperanza, digamos, o en algún momento esta como diferenciación entre lo que podemos llegar a formar nosotras como maestras a nuestros alumnos y lo que pasó en ese entonces. Pero ¿cuál sería su mensaje para ellos en cuanto a cómo permanecer humanamente, cómo hacer estas decisiones de todos los días para que sigamos siendo humanos y tengamos esta capacidad humana de voltear a ver a todos igual que nosotros, o sea, que seamos iguales que ellos, empáticos.
Yeah, certainly one of the lessons or one of the insights I think one gets from studying a case like this is the danger of creating a unit or a wider society like Nazi Germany where one limits one's identity to, one's sense of community only to one's own group and can dehumanize everyone outside that group. In Nazi Germany, there were no such thing as human rights, there were German rights. What was good for Germans was right, what was bad for Germans was wrong. And Helen Fine, had a scholar of genocide, used the phrase to expel someone from the community of human obligation, to put someone outside your moral world. And that's where what I talked earlier about, the ability to dehumanize the victim. And what Nazi Germany did was create a society that was basically centered on the German people, the German folk, and that this was as the Nazis were able to persuade people that they were in a life and death struggle, and that everything on the outside threatened them, everything they did to defend themselves. Genocide is usually prescribed as self-defense. And the Nazis, in fact, defined what they were doing to Jews as an act of self-defense to preserve the German people, because everyone outside the circle of German people didn't count. So if one is talking about how do you create a world or how do you create a society where this doesn't happen, it has to be based upon a notion of human rights, not tribal rights, group rights, national rights, and where notions of rights are universal and not particular just to some people but not to others.
Vamos acá entonces con la profesora.
Sí, buenas tardes. Yo quisiera preguntarle si también investigó algo sobre los perpetradores, pero no militares y no de la SS, sino ciudadanos comunes y corrientes, sobre todo en Polonia, polacos o ucranianos que colaboraron con los nazis.
One of the most sensitive questions we have in the history of the Holocaust is the participation of local populations as collaborators with the Nazis. Everywhere in Europe, Nazis found some people willing to work with them and to help facilitate the killing process. This varied by degree in countries like the Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. Whole killing units are created out of native auxiliary police. In Hungary, it is the Hungarian police that round up and ghettoize Jews and turn them over to the Germans, put them on the trains to Auschwitz. In France, it is the French police that round up Jews, take them to Drancy, put them on the trains. The Germans could not have done what they did in France and Hungary without the local police doing the manpower, providing most of the manpower. Poland is somewhat different from either of those cases. The Germans were afraid enough of Polish nationalism. They didn't want a Polish puppet government. They didn't want large Polish units. They never created battalions of Polish auxiliary police like they did, say, in the Ukraine. But at the municipal level, they did have the so-called blue police, the town cops, the town policemen. And these people were under the supervision of the local German police. So they supplemented German manpower. And often they would guard the ghettos, and often they would engage in roundups. More insidious was the issue of Jews in hiding who were being informed upon or denounced by other Poles. And this, I think, is a combination of factors. For some, it was a matter of greed. They got rewards. For some, it was a matter of anti-Semitism. They hated Jews and thought the only good thing the Germans were doing in Poland was killing Jews. For some, it was fear. If the Germans came and found that Jews had been hidden in this village, there would be collective reprisal. For some who started out helping Jews because the Jews were paying the money, when the money ran out, the Jews now were considered a liability. They couldn't let them go because if somebody caught them and said, "Who were you hiding with?" it would come back to them, so they would turn around and kill the very people they had been hiding out of fear. So we do know that a not insignificant portion of the Polish population did engage in either denunciation or making it hard for Jews to hide. And for people who were hiding Jews, they didn't have to fear the Germans. The Germans were never going to find them in some little village. They had to fear that their neighbors would denounce them. So many people who would have hidden Jews didn't because they knew how dangerous it was, not because of the Germans, but because of fellow Poles. We can't quantify that. I mean, how many people engaged in helping the Germans as opposed to how many people engaged in helping Jews. It is not an even playing field. That is, you can be hiding for 6 years, or from 1941 to 45, 4 years. And you only have to make one mistake at one moment where one person spots you and denounces you and everything fails. To hide a Jew, you have to day after day, week after week, month after month, continue to hide them and no one makes a mistake. It requires many people to save one Jew. It requires one person to turn in many Jews. So it becomes very difficult to how do we equate Poles who help Jews with Poles who denounce Jews or hurt Jews, because it's not an even playing field. And so all we can say is we know both things happened. No Jew survived in Poland who did not have Polish help. And many Jews did not survive because they were denounced not by Germans but by Poles. I don't think we can go beyond that. We don't know. We do know that, as I say, the Poles did not have massive killing units like elsewhere. We do know the Germans distrusted them enough they didn't create large-scale Polish police. But we do know that many Poles made it very difficult for Jews to survive, and the vast majority of Jews trying to survive did not survive the war. The odds were just too great.
And the Ukrainians?
Ukrainians, we know they of course had been under, in a sense, there are two factors there that are added. One, they had been occupied by Stalin and were very bitter about having the communist occupation, which they blamed on Jews because the communists didn't have, they had class discrimination, but not racial discrimination. So when the communists came in, Jews had jobs with the communist regime that they didn't have with the prior regime. And this was immediately interpreted as, oh, they support the communists. And of course, when the Red Army came, local Jews were very glad that the Russians had moved in rather than the Germans. I mean, the consequence of the Germans coming, for them, Hitler's worse than Stalin. For Ukrainians, Stalin was worse than Hitler. So they interpreted this situation completely the opposite. And the second was, of course, Ukrainians desperately wanted national independence, and they thought they could earn it from the Germans if they killed on behalf of the Germans. So they had even more things at work that worked to the disadvantage of Ukrainian Jews.
Vamos allá con la señorita.
Buenas tardes. ¿Por qué cree que para los soldados era mucho más fácil matar la segunda o tercera vez que la primera si era lo mismo que estaban haciendo?
We do know that for most soldiers, most policemen, the first killing was difficult, the next is less difficult, and thereafter it becomes easier and easier. And we see this in the testimony, that they have a vivid memory of the horrors of the first massacre. And later they can hardly distinguish one massacre from another. It's just a routine that they are carrying out. There are some exceptions. People who wanted to be tough, who wanted to be like their comrades. But then, as one said, at a certain moment I just couldn't do it anymore. I went to my sergeant and said, I'm up to my nose on this, let me out. So there were some people who started killing and then refused to do so any longer. But that is a minority. For most people it became easier rather than harder. And I think it's just part of habituation, that brutalization and habituation shape human behavior. And that for most people it became easier rather than harder.
Vamos allá con Juancito. Sí, adelante.
¿Qué lecturas se pueden hacer de los perpetradores de genocidios como el Holocausto en un contexto como el actual?
Yeah, I think the first image, I would say, of the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust after the war, is that it was a very modern genocide, and it was done in a kind of industrial manner. That is, the death camps are factories to murder people on an assembly line basis, in which you have minimal contact, you have a minimum number of perpetrators able to kill a maximum number of victims. A camp like Treblinka, where 950,000 people are killed in 1 year at Treblinka, it has a staff of 30 German SS men, about 110 Ukrainian guards, about 800 work Jews, who are the people who have to empty the gas chambers and take the bodies out and burn them. So you have 30 Germans that basically kill 950,000 people. This is industrial efficiency, and of course Auschwitz was even more modern, the second generation of camp. So we had a notion that this was a genocide very different than the other genocides where you had lots of face-to-face killing. As we did more research, we realized that the death camps basically were for Jews from Central and Western Europe, from Central Poland to the West, that Jews killed in Eastern Poland and in the Soviet territories were killed in the old-fashioned way. They were lined up and shot one by one. And it was a very personal killing. The perpetrators see who they are shooting. They are very close to the victim. It is a manpower-intensive operation, and that it isn't that much different than the genocides of, say, in Armenia or in Cambodia or in Rwanda. The contact between and the large manpower needed to carry out that kind of killing was not different from, I would say, previous genocides. So in a sense, the Holocaust has both a pre-modern, old-fashioned component and a very modern component. And the old-fashioned one shows us that in terms of perpetrators, we are still dealing with face-to-face killers.
So, está bien si pregunto en inglés, es que por escucharlo como que construí en inglés la pregunta.
No, adelante, vamos en inglés.
So, my name is Andrea, and I wanted to ask you regarding the civilian population as well. Not the active civilian population, but the ones who don't participate. Because once for class, I had to read this text. I didn't even finish reading the text for class. Sorry, teacher. And I don't remember this author's name, but she kept arguing that civilians who didn't participate, who didn't hide Jews, but who also, but didn't turn them in, were also perpetrators of genocide. And I was so confused because they didn't help them, but they didn't turn them in. They weren't with the Nazi. I mean, they were probably trying to save their lives. So my question is, would you categorize these non-participating civilians as perpetrators of genocide?
Manolo, can I add something to that? Because I know
Yes.
she's referring to Omer Bartov's work and the notion of bystander.
Yeah. Yes, this issue of how do we define the bystander and what do we mean by that is very difficult. The term was invented by Raoul Hilberg back in the 1980s when he had the three divisions: perpetrator, victim, bystander. And bystander became a kind of collective term for all of the different types of people between the actual killers on the one hand and the victims on the other. This became too broad a category, encompassing too much behavior to remain. I mean, one group we certainly know is what I would now call the parasites or the beneficiaries. That is, the Germans come to town, they round up the Jews, and they take them off, put them on the train to the death camp, or they take them to the nearby forest and shoot them. And the next day, as one Ukrainian witness says, next day everybody's wearing Jewish clothing. They've moved into the Jewish homes, they've dressed themselves in Jewish clothing, they're sleeping in Jewish beds, they're eating off Jewish plates, they're cooking in Jewish pots, that they stole every bit of property that was left, because if they don't, someone else will. The rationale was, why shouldn't I have this? Why should somebody else get it? No sense that this is tainted stuff that you, simply out of decency, you shouldn't put your hands on. Part of that is that, of course, we don't understand how poor life was in Eastern Europe. These are very poor people. Very hard to forego the grabbing a little bit of property when the opportunity is there. And then the rationale that somebody else, why should somebody else get it? And so the theft of Jewish property, I should say what they considered the inheritance of Jewish property, the taking over what they call formerly Jewish property was universal. So we have this group of people I would call the parasites or the beneficiaries. They don't engage in the killing process, but they benefit from it. One step above that, in a sense, are the people who facilitate the killing. It wouldn't have happened if left to themselves, but if somebody else is doing it, they're going to get part of the credit. So they will point out where Jewish hiding places are, they will tell the Germans where Jews have hidden and that sort of thing, or they will even join the Ukrainian police or something of that sort, often for their own benefits. If one of the family joins the Ukrainian police, the rest of the family is exempt from going to forced labor in Germany. People are being rounded up for forced labor all over the place. They can save their family. They get better rations so that they get real benefits for their family by joining the police. And joining the police, of course, means you join in killing Jews. So they, of course, we can say they're perpetrators. They have made a choice that for pay, they're going to be mercenaries and engage in killing. So certainly I would say denouncers and volunteers we would have to call perpetrators. The parasites, they're not exactly perpetrators, but we certainly can't call them bystanders. If by bystander we mean neutral or non-participatory. They participate, but in a different way. And then, of course, you get many people who, as you hear these accounts from the Jews being marched to the train, we can see people peeking around their curtains looking. What does that mean? Probably that they're frightened, but they still want to see what's happening. You can't blame somebody who's hiding in their house because of what the Germans and the Ukrainian police are doing outside. We don't demand that people be heroes and come charging into the streets and say you can't do that. It's nice if someone hides Jews, it's nice if someone protests, but the reality is most people are going to hide and just hope it doesn't affect them. Those people I would call bystanders, that basically they aren't going to disadvantage themselves for the benefit of some other victim group because they don't want to become victims themselves. And we would call, I think we can call that a bystander. They don't go grab Jewish property, they don't denounce Jews, but they certainly do nothing to help Jews. They won't hide Jews because they're afraid. That is, I would say, is the category I would say we could legitimately call a bystander.
Muy bien, vamos ahora ya
es para el tercer grupo de los soldados que decidió no matar directamente a las personas, pero que estuvieron involucrados hasta cierto punto en otras formas. Si después de la guerra existía cierto tipo de culpa o un remordimiento o algo distinto, o si era igual al grupo que antes mencionaste, que hablaba que más bien sentían que no era su culpa, ¿no? O sea, que realmente las circunstancias los llevó a eso y tuvieron la mala suerte de encontrarse ahí.
Yeah. One of the things I was surprised about is the people who were the evaders. We know during the war they said, I'm too weak to get out of it. After the war, they were still very reluctant to appear as witnesses against their comrades. They didn't want to be in the courtroom being seen as on the side of the prosecution, providing evidence against those who had done the killing. So they still are very reluctant. They will even give excuses for why the other people killed and they didn't. One person said, well, I was a watchmaker, I had my watch business, I knew after the war I was going to go back and make a good living. These other people, they came from non-skilled working class jobs, they wanted a better life, they hoped they would become a career policeman. I can understand why they did what they did. It didn't apply to me, but I can understand why they acted differently. So they don't use their evasion as a position of moral authority to accuse their comrades. They do everything to avoid being seen as accusers and therefore don't invoke any moral authority. They don't want to be pulled into the courtroom testifying against their former comrades who did shoot even if they didn't.
¿Otra pregunta, comentario, profesora, por favor?
Thank you, Professor. You have explained us the unique characteristics of the Battalion 101. So why would the sergeants or people who were responsible of drafting this battalion would draft people with such unlikely characteristics to commit these crimes less easily than a younger group or a more Nazi-driven group, or why? I think this group was against all odds, giving these characteristics. I don't know if I'm...
Yeah. First of all, the people who were drafting them into the unit and creating the unit in Hamburg were faced with the end of the manpower pool. That is, you didn't have younger people to draft anymore. This was the next age group that you could still conscript. And I think in their own minds, they were conscripting them to do basically way behind the lines activities that wouldn't involve probably ever even firing their gun. That they would be policemen enforcing, stopping robberies and doing normal police work in German-occupied Europe. I don't think when they sent it out, they had any idea that it was going to do. Because there is no preparation for it. They're sent out, and then it is the commander in southern Poland, Globocnik, who's at the point where this happens in late June, early July, when, because of the new offensive in Russia, he doesn't have trains to take people to the death camps. So he decides, can I shoot them on the spot? Can I use the methods we're using in Russia here? And this is the unit he has. And he orders them to do it, and they do it. So that was, I think, trial and error. I don't know that they even knew whether it would work. What they found was that if they would send shooting specialists, that is, to help the battalion, so the battalion could do the guard work and someone else would pull the trigger, the battalion was much happier. And so in some of these actions, they would actually send other people to be the trigger pullers, and the battalion would simply do would provide all the necessary mass manpower, the roundups and the cordons, and then they would have somebody else sent in to actually do the shooting. When they tried that the first time, the people who came in got so drunk that they couldn't finish, and the battalion had to shoot anyway. So But they were conscious that they were, at the beginning, that they were stretching the limits of what they could ask. Then as it became routine, they didn't have to worry about it anymore.
Profesor, en el debate que tiene usted con Daniel Goldhagen, las conclusiones a las que usted llega, que son situacionales versus las ideológicas, eso tiene una implicación a nuestros días mucho más fuerte, porque quiere decir que teniendo este tipo de situaciones, podría darse nuevamente situaciones iguales de asesinato, sin tener que ideologizar a una sociedad.
I would say, when I wrote my book, it was out there alone. And 4 years later, Goldhagen wrote his book, coming from a strictly cultural, ideological explanation. This is the sufficient explanation, was his argument. So mine then was immediately cast as kind of the opposite. I, in fact, in the book had argued for a multi-causal explanation. That you couldn't explain this in a single way, that it required a multi-causal explanation. So the real difference between us was between a monocausal and a multi-causal explanation. And in that regard, I think even today now, almost all scholars working in this field think that it is a multi-causal explanation that is required. There is no simple one-factor answer that can explain the motivation of people who are involved in the killing. What has happened, I would say, one of the important new contributions, I think this builds in part upon what Newman had said, that we construct the situation. Our cultural assumptions shape the way we read the situation we're in, is that we have to look wider than anti-Semitism. When I wrote my book and he wrote his, the question was sort of how anti-Semitic were the policemen? And ideology was seen in that one dimension of anti-Semitism. What subsequent scholars have argued is we have to look at other cultural factors of the Germans that found great resonance, that allowed the regime to mobilize them for mass murder, even if that ideological factor wasn't specifically anti-Semitic. And I think the scholar that has done the best work there is Thomas Kuhne from Clark University, who has looked at the concepts of comradeship and Volksgemeinschaft. Why is it you could turn the Germans into this group where moral obligation only existed among Germans? And other people, whether it be Soviet POWs, whether it be Jews, whether it be Roma and Sinti, could be outside the boundaries and thus liable to be killed without the people killing them viewing what they were doing as a crime. How you could decouple killing from murder. And his notion was that the Volksgemeinschaft, comradeship, had culturally a special resonance in Germany. They come out of World War I and the trauma of that. The Nazis appropriate them, modify them into racial terms, and that these terms help them, in a sense, win Germans over to, or get Germans to accept that the community that counts is this racial community of Germans and everyone else is outside that. So it's not specifically anti-Semitic, but it's certainly racial. And it allows the Germans to engage in racial killing far beyond Jews. Let's remember, they killed 3.5 million Soviet POWs. They would have been a mass murder regime even if there had never been a Holocaust. So that in this sense, where we've gone further is, one, it must be multi-causal, and secondly, our notion of culture must be much wider than anti-Semitism and look at what concepts were strong, what concepts had resonance in Germany that allowed the Nazis to mobilize and shape people to read the situation they were in as a tribal struggle for survival to which everyone outside the tribe didn't count.
¿Algún otro comentario, pregunta? ¿Algo más? Yo tengo una pregunta. I have a question for you.
Yes.
Why study the perpetrators? perpetrators? Why or how you involve and decide to research this as, or the director of the department speaks, this corner of the humanity. Why you choose this topic?
I guess basically because it wouldn't have happened without them. You don't have mass killing if you don't have mass killers. And so, I mean, they're just an inescapable part of it. And it is, I think, the most perplexing issue. I mean, I've studied policy making, how did the Nazi government go through the process of developing and evolving policy that reaches genocide. And there are some things different, but many of them are very same way other governments make a series of decisions. But we find, I think, with the perpetrators, that's the most, particularly the face-to-face killers, that is the most alien question. That's the one we can answer least well by looking at our own history, our own experience. It seems the most outside anything that we have in our own life. So it is the real challenge for the historian to recover. How, if you're trying to recover the past and to explain past behavior, this is the most difficult question we have. It's like climbing Mount Everest. You know, why do you climb it? Because it is there.
Bueno, pues hemos concluido con esta conferencia. Le damos un aplauso al profesor.